Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going depth on something pretty cool. I think qualitative research.
Oh, yeah.
The kind that goes beyond just numbers and digs into the hows and whys of, like, being human.
Right, exactly.
And we've got a really good stack of sources for this one. We're going to be looking at everything from how qualitative research has changed over time to, those tricky questions of making research believable, and even some really creative and cool ways people are presenting research now.
I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. So let's jump in. I think most people have a general sense of what qualitative research is, but what are some aspects of this field that might surprise our listeners?
You're right. A lot of people think of qualitative research as just interviews or focus groups, but it's so much more than that. One thing that might surprise people is the huge range of methods that are used. We're talking everything from analyzing historical documents to using art as a form of inquiry. And the ways those findings are shared can be surprising too. Imagine encountering research through a poem or even a theatrical performance.
Wow, that's a really different way to think about research. It makes me wonder how the field has developed over time to embrace such a variety of approaches.
Well, the field has gone through quite a journey. If you look at Denzin and Lincoln's work, they've broken down the history of qualitative research in North America into what they call 8 moments. These moments highlight major shifts in thought and practice starting in the early 20th century all the way to the present day.
8 moments, that sounds like a lot to unpack. What stands out to you as a particularly interesting shift in how qualitative research has been approached?
One of the most significant shifts has been the move away from a purely positivist approach, where the goal was to study social phenomena with the same objectivity as you study, say, a chemical reaction.
Right.
Over time, qualitative research has really embraced the idea that the researcher is inherently part of the research process, and that recognizing your own biases and perspectives is crucial. Denzin and Lincoln refer to this as the researcher as a multicultural subject.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't really separate yourself from the research if you're the one asking the questions and interpreting the results.
Right.
It's more about understanding how those biases might be shaping your findings, rather than pretending they don't exist.
Exactly. And that recognition of the researcher's own positionality really sets the stage for the entire research process. Which leads us to another important concept. Denzin and Lincoln put forward the 5 phases of qualitative research. It's a roadmap for conducting research rigorously and thoughtfully.
Okay, let's dive into those 5 phases. What's the first one all about?
The first phase, as we've touched on, is the researcher as a multicultural subject. It's about acknowledging that you as a researcher bring your own background beliefs and experiences to the table, and that these can influence how you design your study, how you collect data, and how you interpret what you find.
So, step one is really about some serious self reflection. I imagine this can be a pretty challenging process for researchers.
It can be. It requires a lot of honesty and self-awareness. But it's a crucial step in ensuring that your research is as credible and trustworthy as possible. Because let's be real, we all have biases, whether we're aware of them or not. The key is to acknowledge them and try to mitigate their impact on the research process.
That makes sense. So, once a researcher has done that internal work, what's next on the roadmap?
The second phase is all about choosing the right theoretical lens. Denzin and Lincoln call this theoretical paradigms and perspectives. This is where you decide what theoretical framework will guide your research. Will you be looking at the world through a feminist lens, a critical race theory lens, maybe a post-colonial perspective? This choice really shapes how you approach your research question and what you look for in your data.
So, you're not just diving into research blindly, you're making conscious decisions about what perspective you're bringing to the table and how that might influence your findings. It sounds like each phase builds on the one before it. What comes after choosing a theoretical framework?
Phase 3 is research strategies and methods, which is where the rubber meets the road. Now that you have a clear theoretical perspective, you need to choose specific methods to collect data.
Okay.
Will you be using interviews, focus groups, observational data? Maybe you'll be analyzing existing documents like historical records or social media posts. The key is to select methods that align with your research question and the overall goals of your study.
Okay, so you're making strategic choices about the best way to get the information you need to answer your research question. What happens once you've gathered all that data?
Phase 4 is all about making sense of that raw material. It's called collection and analysis of empirical materials. This is where you transcribe those interviews, organize your field notes, code your data, and look for patterns and themes. It's a meticulous process that requires a lot of attention to detail and a willingness to immerse yourself in the data.
It sounds like this phase is where a lot of those aha moments happen, those unexpected insights that emerge from the data. What's the final phase in Denzin and Lincoln's model?
The final phase is interpretation and representation. This is where you take all those insights gleaned from your data analysis and decide how you're going to share them with the world.
Okay.
Traditionally, this might have involved writing a formal research report, but qualitative researchers are increasingly exploring more creative ways to share their findings.
You mentioned earlier that people might encounter qualitative research in a poem or a performance. It sounds like those creative approaches fall into this final phase of interpretation and representation.
You got it. It's about recognizing that the way you present your research can be just as important as the findings themselves. And with qualitative research, where you're dealing with such rich, nuanced data, sometimes those traditional report formats just don't cut it.
So it's not just about being factual and objective. It's about finding ways to engage your audience, to make them feel something, to help them connect with the human stories behind the research.
Right.
I'm really curious to dive into some of those creative examples later on. But first, there's another aspect of qualitative research that I think we need to address, this idea of making your research believable, especially when you're dealing with subjective experiences and multiple perspectives. How do you ensure that your research is rigorous and trustworthy?
That's a question that qualitative researchers have been grappling with for decades. And it's one of the things that sets qualitative research apart from quantitative research, which often relies on statistical analysis to determine the validity of findings. In qualitative research, it's more about ensuring that your interpretations are credible, transferable, and confirmable.
Can you unpack those terms a bit? What does it mean for qualitative research to be credible, for example?
Credibility is about ensuring that your findings are grounded in the data. It's about showing that you've taken steps to ensure that your interpretations are accurate and that you haven't let your own biases unduly influence your conclusions.
So it's not about claiming to be completely objective, but rather about being transparent about your process and demonstrating that you've taken steps to ensure the trustworthiness of your findings. What about transferability?
Transferability is the idea that your findings might be applicable to other contexts or settings. It's about providing enough rich detail and context so that readers can decide for themselves whether your findings resonate with their own experiences or understanding of a particular phenomenon.
Okay, so it's not about claiming that your findings are universally true, but rather about providing enough information so that others can judge whether those findings might be relevant to their own situations. And what about confirmability? What does that entail?
Confirmability is about demonstrating that your findings are supported by the data and that you haven't just cherry-picked evidence to support your preconceived notions. It's about showing that you've been systematic and thorough in your analysis and that your interpretations are grounded in the evidence.
It sounds like all three of these concepts, credibility, transferability, and confirmability, are really about being transparent, rigorous, and accountable throughout the research process.
Exactly. Qualitative research embraces subjectivity, but that doesn't mean it's any less rigorous. It's just a different kind of rigor, one that focuses on depth of understanding, nuanced interpretation, and ethical engagement with the data.
I'm really appreciating this deeper look into the philosophy behind qualitative research. It helps me understand why those questions of believability are so important. Are there specific strategies that researchers use to ensure their work meets these criteria?
Absolutely. Qualitative researchers have developed a whole toolkit of techniques to enhance the believability of their work. One common technique is triangulation, where you use multiple sources of data to corroborate your findings.
So instead of relying solely on interviews, for example, you might also incorporate observational data or document analysis to provide a more well-rounded perspective.
Exactly. Another technique is member checking, where you go back to the participants in your study and share your interpretations with them, asking for their feedback and confirmation.
That sounds like a great way to ensure that you're accurately capturing the participants' perspectives and that your interpretations resonate with their lived experience.
It is. It's also a way of making the research process more collaborative and empowering for participants. Other techniques include thick, rich description, where you provide enough vivid detail to transport the reader into the world you're studying, and peer debriefing, where you have a colleague review your work to provide an outside perspective and identify any potential blind spots.
It sounds like qualitative researchers are really putting in the work to ensure their findings are trustworthy and meaningful. I'm really starting to grasp the depth and complexity of this field, but I can't help but wonder, with all this emphasis on believability and rigor, is there still room for creativity in qualitative research?
That's a great question. and it's one that leads us to some of the most exciting developments in the field. The truth is the lines between rigorous research and creative expression are becoming increasingly blurred in qualitative research, and that's a good thing.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
What's exciting is that this blurring of boundaries really opens up uh, new possibilities for sharing research in ways that are engaging, impactful, and maybe even transformative for both the researcher and the audience.
So it's not just about adding a bit of flair to a dry research report. It's about fundamentally rethinking how we communicate complex ideas and connect with people on an emotional level. I'm ready to dive into some concrete examples. Where do we start?
Well, one example that really highlights this shift is the work of Norman Denzin himself. He's actually experimented with writing what he calls critical qualitative inquiry novels.
Novels. So he's taking research findings and weaving them into fictional stories.
Not entirely fictional. Think of them more as methodological novels. They blend real-world research with fictionalized narratives to explore complex research themes in a way that a traditional research report just couldn't achieve.
I'm starting to see how this could be really powerful. You're not just presenting cold, hard facts, you're inviting the reader to step into a world and experience those themes in a more visceral way. Are there other examples of researchers using fiction to share their findings?
Absolutely. Carolyn Ellis, another prominent qualitative researcher, wrote a book called The Ethnographic Eye.
Hmm.
It's a novel about her own experiences as an autoethnographer, where the researcher is also the subject of the study.
So she's writing a fictionalized account of herself doing research. That's pretty meta.
It is. And it allows her to explore the emotional and ethical complexities of autoethnography in a way that's both personal and intellectually rigorous.
It makes me wonder, do you think this approach could help bridge that gap between academia and the general public? Could reading a novel about research be a more accessible entry point for people who might be intimidated by traditional academic writing?
It's certainly possible. Fiction has a way of drawing us in, making us care about the characters and their experiences. If you can weave research insights into a compelling narrative, it has the potential to reach a much broader audience.
Okay, so we've got novels. What other creative avenues are qualitative researchers exploring?
Another really fascinating area is performance ethnography. As the name suggests, it involves using performance art to share research findings.
So instead of just reading about research, you might actually see it performed on stage.
Exactly. Performance ethnography can take many forms. It could be a solo performance based on a researcher's fieldwork, a play developed in collaboration with the community, a dance piece that explores a particular social issue, or even a musical composition inspired by research data. It's about bringing research to life in a way that engages the senses and emotions.
It's almost like turning research into an embodied experience. I can see how that could be really powerful, especially for communicating research on topics that are emotionally charged or difficult to articulate in words alone. Are there specific examples that come to mind?
There are so many great examples out there. I've seen performances about everything from the experiences of refugees to the challenges of living with chronic illness.
Yeah.
There's a real power in seeing those stories come to life on stage in the bodies and voices of the performers.
It makes me think about the potential for this kind of work to build empathy and understanding. If you can see and feel someone else's story, it's harder to dismiss or ignore their experiences.
I agree. Performance ethnography has the potential to create really powerful connections between researchers, participants, and audiences. It can break down barriers, spark conversations, and maybe even inspire social change.
This is really making me rethink what research can be. It's not just about collecting data and writing reports. It's about finding creative ways to share those findings and connect with people on a human level. I'm curious, what are some of the challenges of using these creative approaches?
One of the biggest challenges is ensuring that the creative work remains grounded in the research. It's easy to get carried away with the artistic side of things and lose sight of the original research goals.
So you need to find that balance between artistic expression and research integrity.
Exactly. It's also important to be mindful of the potential for misinterpretation. Art is often open to multiple readings, and while that can be a strength, it's also something to be aware of when presenting research findings.
You don't want to sacrifice clarity or accuracy for the sake of artistic flair.
Right. And finally, there's the challenge of legitimacy. The academic world can be pretty traditional, and some folks still view creative approaches to research as less rigorous or less scientific.
It's like that old debate between art and science, between subjective experience and objective truth.
Exactly. But I think that's starting to change. There's a growing recognition that these creative approaches can actually enhance the rigor and impact of qualitative research.
I'm glad to hear that. It sounds like these creative approaches offer so much potential for engaging with research in new and exciting ways. But we've been talking a lot about the researcher's perspective. I'm curious, how do participants feel about being involved in research that uses these creative methods?
That's a great question, and it's one that researchers need to consider carefully. For some participants, it can be incredibly empowering to have their stories shared through art. It can give them a voice, a platform to be heard and seen.
It's almost like a form of activism using art to raise awareness and advocate for change.
Exactly. But it's not always a positive experience for everyone. Some participants might feel uncomfortable with the idea of their stories being shared in such a public way. Others might worry about being misrepresented or exploited.
So it's really important for researchers to approach these creative methods with sensitivity and respect for the participants' wishes and perspectives.
Absolutely. Ethical considerations are paramount in qualitative research, and that's especially true when you're dealing with creative methods that can potentially expose participants to greater vulnerability.
It sounds like there's a lot to navigate. Are there specific guidelines or best practices for researchers who are using these creative approaches?
There are many professional organizations like the American Anthropological Association have developed ethical guidelines for researchers who are using creative methods. These guidelines emphasize the importance of informed consent, confidentiality, and the researcher's responsibility to protect the well-being of their participants.
So it's not just about getting permission at the beginning of a study, it's about being mindful of the ethical implications of your work throughout the entire research process.
Precisely. And it's an ongoing conversation.
Ah,
As these creative methods continue to evolve, we need to keep having these critical conversations about ethics and responsibility.
that makes sense. It seems like qualitative research is constantly pushing boundaries and challenging us to think differently, not just about the research itself, but also about the ethical implications of how we conduct and share that research.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes it such a vibrant and dynamic field. It's not just about finding answers, it's about asking better questions and finding more meaningful ways to engage with the complexity of human experience.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the historical roots of qualitative research to the exciting possibilities of creative representation. I'm curious, as we wrap up our discussion, what stands out to you as a particularly important takeaway for our listener?
What stands out to me is that qualitative research offers like a way of seeing the world with more nuance and complexity. It encourages us to look beyond the surface, to question assumptions, and to embrace the idea that there are multiple ways of knowing and understanding.
It's almost like qualitative research provides a different lens for looking at the world, one that allows you to see things that might otherwise be hidden or overlooked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in a world that's increasingly driven by data and algorithms, that human-centered perspective offered by qualitative research feels more essential than ever.
Yeah, especially with the constant bombardment of information we all face these days. It feels crucial to have tools to critically examine those narratives and to understand the human motivations and experiences that shape those stories.
You've hit the nail on the head. Qualitative research can help us become more discerning consumers of information, less swayed by hype or simplistic explanations. It encourages us to ask why and how, not just what.
It's like developing a superpower for navigating the complexities of the 21st century. And the best part is it's a superpower that's available to anyone. You don't need a PhD to start asking critical questions, listening to diverse perspectives, and seeking a deeper understanding of the world around you.
I love that analogy. It highlights the fact that qualitative research isn't just an academic pursuit. It's a way of being the world, a way of approaching life with curiosity and an open mind.
You've given our listener a lot to think about today. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the power and potential of quality.
Here. And if you're feeling inspired, I encourage you to explore further. There are so many amazing resources available, from books and articles to podcasts and online courses. Don't be afraid to dive in and see where your curiosity leads you.
And remember, qualitative research is more than just a set of methods. It's a way of seeing the world, a way of connecting with others, and a way of making a difference.
Beautifully said. So to our listener, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that curiosity alive.
Until next time, stay curious.